The wind carried the scent of ashes long after the fire had died. Black smoke curled against the evening sky, drifting over the scorched valley where a small cabin once stood. The ground was still warm, the fence posts smoldering, the corral empty except for a broken gate swinging weakly in the wind. What had been a peaceful home that morning was now a heap of charred timber and silence. Somewhere among the ruins lay the pieces of a man's life, burned, taken, and scattered by those who thought they had finished him. He came back at dusk, leading a weary horse through the drifting smoke. His boots crunched over the blackened earth, his jaw tight, his eyes hollow with disbelief. The cabin door had fallen inward, and when he stepped over it, the boards broke beneath his weight. Inside, everything smelled of burned wood and oil. The table where his wife once served bread was gone. The rocking chair she used to mend his shirts had turned to ash. And the locket she wore. He found it half buried under a beam, still warm to the touch. He stood there for a long while, holding that locket in his hand as the light faded. The wind howled through the open doorway, and the coyotes began to cry in the far hills. There was no sign of her. No body, no tracks that led to peace. Only hoof marks headed east toward the red cliffs. His mind burned hotter than the fire that had swallowed his home. Whoever had done this had not killed her. They had taken her, and that made his rage colder, sharper. People in town had always said he was a quiet man, the kind who stayed clear of trouble. He worked his land, paid his dues, and never spoke more than needed. But beneath that calm lay something older, a scarred soul that had seen war before peace ever reached these lands. Years ago, he had ridden with scouts and seen what men were capable of when law had not yet caught up to greed. He had buried friends under hard soil and learned what mercy cost in a land that had none. When he rode into town that night, his horse was blackened with soot, and his eyes were darker than coal. The few who dared to speak asked what happened, but he only said one sentence, short, heavy, and final. They took her. That was enough to make the barkeep stop polishing his glass, and the sheriff looked down at his boots. The next morning, the town woke to find him gone again. His rifle, his saddle, and a bundle of supplies were missing from the stable. No one knew where he went, but those who remembered his past knew he wasn't riding east for help. He was heading south, toward the Apache lands. Months passed. Winter came, then faded into spring. Travelers passing through spoke of a white man who had gone into the desert and never come back. Some said he was mad. Others said he'd been killed for trespassing on tribal ground. But one evening, a trader returned from the southern mesas with a story that spread faster than wildfire. He said he'd seen a man who looked like death itself, taller, leaner, with sunburned skin and a stare that could cut through stone. He wore Apache beads around his neck and rode among warriors who treated him like one of their own. The trader said he'd overheard their leader speak, a tall warrior with eagle feathers in his hair and fire in his voice. "We will ride north," the man said. "We will take back what was stolen." The trader had laughed at first, thinking it was just talk. But when he saw the camp, a sea of riders sharpening blades and mending rifles, his laughter turned to silence. There were hundreds of them. Back at the settlement, folks tried to forget. Life moved on, as it always did on the frontier. The plains turned green again, and wagon trains rolled by, leaving dust trails in the air. But sometimes, in the dead of night, the older men sitting by the saloon fire would talk in low voices about what was coming. They said the quiet man had become something else out there in the desert, something that didn't sleep or forgive. They said he'd found a reason to live again, and that reason was vengeance. One evening, a scout came riding from the south with a warning. He'd seen smoke columns on the horizon, too many to count. At first, people thought it was a storm, but as the shapes drew closer, the air began to tremble with the rhythm of hooves. Dust rose like a living cloud, and under that haze rode 500 Apache warriors, their faces painted, their eyes fixed on the north. At their head was the same man whose home had burned and whose heart had been taken. He rode without a word, his rifle slung across his back, his hand resting on the locket that still hung around his neck. Behind him, warriors carried lances wrapped in red cloth and rifles polished like mirrors. Their horses snorted and pawed at the earth, waiting for a signal. He didn't speak much to them. He didn't have to. The bond forged in fire and blood didn't need words. They had taken him in when he had nothing left, taught him how to survive the wastelands and move like a shadow across the desert. And in return, he had given them something they had lost. Trust in a man who wasn't born of their blood but carried their same wounds. Together, they had become one force, united by grief and vengeance. Somewhere up north, beyond the rolling hills, were the men who had done it. ranchers with rifles and soldiers with orders. They thought the fire had ended everything. They didn't know that fire had birthed something far worse. By nightfall, the riders reached the edge of the valley where his cabin once stood. The air smelled faintly of burned timber again, though months had passed since the night had happened. He dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the same blackened soil. The Apache warriors waited in silence behind him, their faces lit by the flickering torches. He reached down and touched the ground as if greeting an old friend. Then he looked up at the stars and spoke softly. "Tonight, it ends." The warriors moved without sound, spreading across the ridgelines like shadows. Down below, the town lay quiet, unaware of the storm that was about to break. Lamps flickered in windows, a dog barked somewhere in the dark, and a lone man stumbled from the saloon, too drunk to notice the silhouettes gathering in the hills. The wind picked up again, carrying the smell of sage and smoke. The leader stood motionless, his rifle resting in his hand, his gaze locked on the horizon where his pain had begun. Somewhere among the hills, his wife might still be alive, or gone forever. He didn't know which truth was waiting for him, but he was ready to meet it no matter the cost. When the first arrow caught the moonlight and whistled through the air, the night exploded into chaos. Horses screamed, doors burst open, and the once silent valley echoed with the sound of war. And through that rising storm, the man who had lost everything rode at the front, his heart no longer his own, his past no longer buried. The fire they had started had come back to them, brighter and fiercer than before. But somewhere amid that vengeance, another question burned. If he found her, would she even recognize what he had become? The answer waited in the dark just beyond the flames. Long before the fire, before the world turned to ash, the valley had been a quiet place where the sound of wind through cottonwoods was the loudest thing for miles. The man had come there years ago with a wagon, 2 horses, and a dream small enough to fit inside a wooden box. He wasn't rich, but he had something rarer than gold: peace. He built his cabin with his own hands, one board at a time, cutting the logs from the nearby pines and hauling them down the ridge. The land was hard, rocky in places, but he knew how to make it live. Every sunrise, he plowed the soil, planted corn, and fixed fences while his wife tended the garden behind the cabin. She had laughter that carried across the field, soft but full of life, the kind that made even a dying man believe the world could start again. Their life was simple, but full. When the harvest came, she would hang drying herbs along the windows, and he would carve new handles for the tools. On Sundays, they would ride to town for supplies, share a meal with neighbors, and talk about how quiet things had become since the army had moved the tribes farther south. Folks said peace was returning to the frontier, that the worst was behind them. But out beyond the ridges, the tension never really left. Old wounds ran deep, and men with greed in their hearts always found reasons to stir the ashes of hate. The trouble began when a group of ranchers started claiming land along the river, saying the valley water belonged to them. They were powerful men, backed by soldiers who didn't care much for homesteaders. The man had refused to sell. He told them he had bought this land fair, signed by the county clerk and witnessed by God himself. But papers meant little when rifles were pointed, and threats carried more weight than laws. For weeks he noticed riders watching from the ridge. Strangers. Some wore army coats, others rough leather. Once he found his fence cut and his livestock missing. Another time, his barn door was marked with paint, a warning that this land would soon change hands. His wife begged him to leave, to move farther west, but he couldn't. "This is our home," he said, "and I built it with my own hands." She didn't argue again after that. She only prayed harder at night. Then one day, everything changed. It was early morning, the air cool and still. He had gone into town for supplies, leaving her behind with their dog and a day's worth of chores. By the time he returned, the smoke was already rising. He rode faster than he ever had, heart pounding like a drum. The fire had started at the barn and spread quick with the dry wind. There was no sign of her anywhere, only hoofprints leading east. He followed them for miles until the trail vanished among the rocks. When he reached the town again, the sheriff only shook his head. "Best to move on," the man said. "This valley ain't safe no more. Whoever did it won't be caught." But moving on wasn't an option. Not for him. Not when the only thing that mattered had been taken. For 3 days he searched the hills with nothing but a canteen and his rifle. He found signs, a piece of cloth snagged on a cactus, a silver button half buried in the dust. But no body, no blood. That meant she was alive. That thought kept him moving, even when hunger set in and his strength began to fade. He rode until his horse collapsed, then walked until his boots tore apart. Finally, when he was too weak to go on, he fell near a stream that cut through the red desert. He thought he would die there, but he didn't. When he opened his eyes, he was surrounded by Apache. Warriors stood over him, their faces unreadable. He reached for his rifle, but one of them kicked it away. The leader stepped forward, a tall man with paint streaked across his chest and a scar along his cheek. For a long moment they stared at each other, both broken in different ways. Then the warrior handed him water. That was the beginning. The Apache took him in, though not easily. At first they treated him as a prisoner. They watched every move, fed him little, and spoke in low voices he couldn't understand. But he didn't fight them. He sat among them, learned their ways, and listened. They soon realized he wasn't like the soldiers or settlers who had hunted them for years. He carried the same kind of pain they did, the pain of losing everything to men who thought they had the right to take it. Weeks turned into months. He learned their language bit by bit, their songs by night, their silence by day. The warrior who had saved him became his teacher, showing him how to move through the desert without leaving a trace, how to track men by the smallest signs, and how to strike only when the moment was right. They trained together under the blazing sun until the man's old self was gone, replaced by something leaner, quieter, harder. The Apache respected him because he didn't ask for pity. He worked, hunted, and fought beside them when the soldiers raided their camps. Slowly they began to see him as one of their own. He earned a name among them, one that meant, the man who walked through fire. Still, every night when the campfire burned low, he would take out the locket he'd found among the ashes of his cabin. Inside was the small portrait of his wife, her eyes full of light. That image kept him from forgetting who he was. He didn't seek revenge for glory or bloodlust. He sought it because somewhere out there she was waiting, or suffering, or gone, and he had to know which. Over time, the Apache began to share their own stories with him. They too had lost homes, wives, and children to raids led by the same kind of men who had burned his cabin. Their anger matched his. Their cause became his. When he finally spoke of returning north, hundreds volunteered to ride with him, not for payment but for honor, to strike back against those who thought they could burn and take without consequence. So when he came riding over the ridge that night with 500 warriors at his back, he wasn't leading them as a white man. He was leading them as a brother of the desert, bound by the same grief that had bound them for generations. But not everyone in the town had been his enemy. Among those who had watched the smoke rise months ago was a young woman who had once been his wife's closest friend. She had tried to warn him before the fire, telling him that the ranchers were planning something cruel, but he hadn't believed her. Now she lived with that guilt, watching from her porch as the dust of approaching riders grew thicker. The night he returned, she was the first to recognize him. His face was darker now, his eyes sharper, but she knew that stare. She stepped into the road as the horses approached, holding up a lantern. The light flickered across his face, and for a moment she saw the ghost of the man she once knew. He stopped his horse and looked down at her without speaking. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. "They'll kill you if they see you." He didn't answer. His voice had changed, roughened by months of wind and sand. "Where are they?" She looked toward the ranch beyond the ridge. "Still there. Still proud. They think you're dead." He nodded once, slow and deliberate. The Apache behind him waited in silence, their torches burning low. She wanted to say more, to beg him not to do whatever he'd come to do, but his gaze was already past her, fixed on the horizon. There was no stopping him now. As he rode away, she whispered a prayer, knowing she might never see him again. Behind him, the wind carried the low chant of warriors preparing for battle, a rhythm that echoed like thunder across the valley. The stars above seemed to tremble, as if they too knew what was about to come. Far ahead in the darkness, the men who had burned his house and taken his wife slept soundly, never knowing that fate was already riding toward them. But vengeance had its own cost. And though the man didn't yet feel it, every step closer to his enemies was also a step further from the life he once had. Somewhere in those hills, the truth about his wife waited for him, but whether it would heal him or destroy him, that part of the story was yet to be written. The night was quiet but alive with tension. The Apache warriors waited among the ridges, their horses restless, the faint sound of leather and breath blending with the sigh of the wind. Down below, the valley slept under a thin veil of moonlight. Lanterns glowed faintly in the windows of the ranch houses, and dogs barked now and then, uneasy without knowing why. The man watched it all from the shadow of a cedar tree, his rifle resting against his leg. He had returned to the same land where his life had been stolen, and yet it felt like a foreign world now. The soil that once grew his crops now waited to drink blood. He had not spoken much since the riders left the desert. The Apache trusted his silence. They understood that vengeance had its own language. Still, their leader, the warrior who had first saved him, walked up beside him that night. "We strike when the sun rises," the warrior said. "But tell me, will your heart find peace after?" The man didn't answer at first. He looked toward the ranch lights flickering in the distance. Somewhere in that direction were the men who had burned his home, but maybe also the woman he'd lost. That thought twisted like a knife inside him. "Peace isn't what I'm looking for," he said finally. "I just want truth." As he spoke, his mind went back to the woman in town, the one who had stood in the road holding the lantern. Her warning echoed in his thoughts. "They'll kill you if they see you." She had looked frightened, and not just for him. Maybe she knew more than she said. He'd seen guilt in her eyes, as if she carried some secret about what had really happened that night. The hours crawled by slowly. Fires burned low along the ridge where the Apache camped. Men murmured prayers in their language, and the younger warriors painted symbols on their faces, marks for protection, for strength, for victory. The man sat apart from them, turning the small locket over in his fingers. Every time he opened it, he saw her smile staring back at him. It filled him with both warmth and pain. He remembered her voice on the morning before the fire. She had been humming as she fixed his collar, teasing him about his silence. "You think too much," she had said. "One day all that thinking will keep you from hearing the world." She'd laughed then and kissed his cheek before he rode out. That memory had kept him alive through every mile of desert he crossed. Now it was a blade cutting both ways, comfort and torment in one. When the sky began to pale, the warriors prepared to move. They mounted their horses, faces streaked with red and white paint, rifles strapped to their backs. The man rose too, his movement steady but cold. The leader handed him a bow and a handful of arrows. "You ride with us as brother," he said. "But remember, no war ends the way a man hopes." They moved silently through the brush, following the dry creek bed that led toward the ranch. The earth smelled of sage and dust, and the faint cry of an owl echoed above them. When they reached the edge of the property, they dismounted and spread out, forming a wide circle. From where he stood, the man could see the same barn that once belonged to his neighbors, the same windmill turning slowly in the morning air. It was strange to see life still here when his own had been burned away. As they waited, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Two riders were patrolling near the corral. He recognized one of them even from a distance, a tall, broad man with a crooked hat and a limp. He had seen that limp before. The night of the fire, there had been tracks, uneven ones, heading east. That limp had been burned into his memory. His hands tightened around the rifle. But before he could move, the Apache leader lifted his hand. "Wait," he whispered. "We see who else comes." The man lowered his rifle, his breath steady but tight. Then he saw something that made his heart freeze. A woman stepped out of the main house, her figure faint in the growing light. She carried a water pail and walked toward the well. For a moment he thought it was a trick of the light, a ghost come to haunt him. But then she turned, and even from afar he knew that walk, that hair, that shape. His wife. He felt the ground tilt under him. The locket slipped from his fingers, landing silently in the dirt. She was alive. Alive here, among the very men who had destroyed everything. The warrior beside him saw the change in his face. "Is it her?" he asked quietly. He nodded once, unable to speak. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought it might break. Every instinct screamed to run to her, to call her name, but the sight of armed men near her stopped him cold. He could tell by the way she moved, slow, careful, eyes down, that she wasn't free. The leader touched his shoulder. "You strike now and she dies too." He clenched his jaw, forcing the rage down. The fire inside him burned hotter than ever, but he swallowed it just as he had learned in the desert. "Then we wait," he said. The warriors pulled back into the shadows as the sun broke over the hills. Smoke began to rise from the chimneys and the ranch came alive. Men saddled horses, others loaded wagons, and one stood at the fence shouting orders. The man watched it all in silence, memorizing faces, counting rifles, measuring every move. He wasn't thinking of revenge anymore. Now it was about getting her out alive. That night, when the campfire burned low again, he spoke to the Apache leader in private. "We changed the plan," he said. "We don't burn their homes yet. Not until she's safe." The leader studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You want war and mercy both," he said. That is a dangerous mix. Then I'll carry the danger, the man replied. He knew he couldn't trust anyone in town, not after the sheriff had turned a blind eye and the ranchers had acted like kings. But there was one person who might still help, the woman with the lantern. She had known something before, maybe enough to lead him to the truth. That night he rode alone into town, leaving the Apache hidden among the hills. The town was quiet when he arrived. Only the saloon had light spilling through its cracked windows. He tied his horse behind the old livery and walked down the side street toward her house. When she opened the door, her face went pale. "I told you to leave this place," she whispered. "I found her," he said. "She's alive." Her eyes widened. "Alive, you're sure?" He nodded. "At the ranch, but something's wrong. She's there with them." "I need to know why." The woman hesitated, wringing her hands. "You don't understand. They didn't just take her. They made her stay. Those men. They made her part of what they built. If you go after them alone, they'll kill her first." He stepped closer. "Then help me stop that." She looked torn, fear and guilt battling in her eyes. "There's something else you should know," she said finally. "The one who ordered it wasn't just a rancher. He was working for someone higher, the same man who's been paying the army to clear this land. Your wife wasn't meant to die. She was meant to be used." He felt the words like a blow to the chest. All this time he had thought it was a simple act of cruelty, men drunk on power. But now he saw the bigger hand behind it, a plan to take the valley. Every inch of it, no matter who had to burn for it. He left her house before dawn, the weight of her words pressing down like iron. Back in camp, he told the Apache what he had learned. Their leader's face darkened. "Then this war is larger than your home," he said. "It is our war, too." The man looked out over the ridges where the stars were fading. The fire of revenge that once blinded him now burned with purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. The valley had bled too long under men who thought they owned it. When he closed his eyes, he saw her face again, her hands trembling as she lifted that water pail. He swore then, quietly, that he would bring her back, not as a ghost of what she had been, but as the woman who once filled their cabin with laughter. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain and smoke. The Apache warriors lifted their heads, sensing the coming storm. Somewhere down below, the ranchers slept, dreaming of power they believed no one could challenge. But up in the dark hills, 500 riders waited with fire in their hearts, and one man among them had already decided that dawn would never look the same again. The air was heavy that night, thick with the scent of dust and rain that had not yet fallen. The Apache warriors waited in silence among the trees, their horses restless, their eyes fixed on the valley below where the ranch lights burned against the dark. From that distance it looked peaceful, quiet houses, a barn, and a few scattered campfires glowing faintly. But the man knew peace was a lie here. Behind those lights were the same men who had taken everything from him, the same ones who now held his wife like a prize from a war they thought they'd already won. He stood apart from the warriors, his coat pulled tight against the wind. The locket still hung from his neck, pressed close to his chest. It had become his anchor, a reminder of what he was fighting for and what he might still lose. Every moment brought him closer to a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. If she was alive but changed, if the months had broken her spirit, then what would he be rescuing? A woman who remembered him, or a shadow of who she used to be? The Apache leader approached quietly. "The men you want," he said. "They will be gathered by the corral come morning. That is when they will be weakest." The man nodded, but his thoughts were far away. He had spent days watching the ranch, memorizing every pattern. He knew where the guards patrolled, where the wagons stood, even where she slept. He had seen her window light flicker late into the night. Sometimes she would stand there for minutes, staring out into the darkness as if she felt him near. But she never called, never moved toward the edge of the fence. It was as if something bound her there, stronger than rope. That night before the attack, he sent 2 scouts ahead to find a path through the north side of the ranch. He didn't want a massacre, only precision. Get her out, then strike. But war rarely follows plans made in peace. Just before dawn, the storm that had been gathering broke loose. Lightning ripped across the sky, lighting the hills in flashes of white. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying dust and the sound of the horses snorting nervously. It was as if the land itself was waking up to witness what was coming. The warriors moved like ghosts, their faces streaked with rain and paint, their eyes steady. The man walked among them, saying nothing. His mind was calm, but his heart beat so loud it drowned the thunder. As they neared the outer fence, one of the young scouts signaled. A patrol was coming from the west. The man raised his hand and the warriors melted into the brush. The two riders passed close, talking softly, their rifles slung loose across their saddles. He caught only fragments of their words, something about new orders, about moving the woman after sunrise. He waited until they were almost gone before stepping out of the shadows. One of them turned too late. The butt of the man's rifle struck him square in the jaw, sending him crumpling from the saddle. The second reached for his gun, but an arrow flew from the dark, hitting the ground beside his boot. The rider froze, eyes wide. The man pressed his rifle against the man's chest. "Where are they taking her?" The rider swallowed hard, the rain running down his face. "To the old mill," he stammered. "They said the boss wants her there before the soldiers arrive. He said no one touches her till he says so." The man's grip tightened. "Why the mill?" The rider hesitated. "They said he's selling the land. Needs proof she's still alive. Said the papers are being signed tomorrow." The words hit harder than a bullet. Proof. That's all she was to them now. Evidence to help steal what little remained of his world. He struck the man once with the rifle butt and motioned for the Apache to bind him. The leader came up beside him. "Will we go now?" he said. The man nodded. "No noise, no flames until she's safe." They moved quickly, weaving through the storm. The path to the mill was rough, cutting between the rocks and through a narrow pass. Lightning flared again, lighting the shape of the building in the distance, a broken structure of stone and timber, standing alone by the creek. The sound of rushing water mixed with the pounding of hooves as they closed in. The man dismounted near the edge and crawled forward to scout. Through the rain, he saw guards posted near the entrance, 2 more under the awning of the porch, and there, through a shattered window, a flicker of light. Inside, his wife sat on a wooden chair, her hands bound, her head bowed. The sight froze him. She was thinner now, her hair tangled, but she was alive. Before he could move, one of the warriors touched his shoulder. "There," the man whispered, pointing to a figure moving inside. The ranch leader, the one with the limp, walked around her slowly, speaking in a voice they couldn't hear over the storm. Every now and then he would stop, lean closer, say something that made her flinch. The man's hands curled into fists. "We take them now," the Apache leader said. "No," he whispered. "Wait," he needed a plan. Rushing in would bring chaos and she could be caught in the crossfire. He signaled for 2 warriors to circle around the back while he took the front. As he waited, another flash of lightning revealed movement by the creek. Soldiers. 3 of them, moving fast toward the mill. The deal was already in motion. The man turned to his ally. "We don't have time," he said. "They'll take her before dawn." The Apache leader gave a sharp nod. "Then we make dawn come early." The next moment, the silence shattered. An arrow flew from the darkness, striking one of the guards near the porch. Another warrior rushed from the side, his knife flashing in the rain. Gunfire erupted, echoing across the valley like rolling thunder. The man charged forward, kicking through the door as bullets splintered the frame. Inside, the air filled with smoke and the smell of wet wood. The ranch leader turned, drawing his pistol. "Hugh," he spat, disbelief flashing in his eyes. "I saw your house burn." The man fired first, hitting the wall behind him. The shot missed by inches as the leader ducked behind a table. The woman screamed his name, her voice sharp and raw. He crossed the room, cutting the ropes around her wrist with a quick slash of his knife. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded weakly, tears mixing with rain. "They said you were dead," she whispered. "They said they burned everything." "They almost did," he said. "But I found fire of my own." Outside, the battle raged. Apache riders swept in from both sides, their war cries piercing through the storm. The soldiers by the creek fired wildly, trying to form a line, but they were surrounded. The sound of hoofbeats shook the ground. The flashes of rifles lit the rain like lightning. The valley had turned into a storm of men and fury. Inside the mill, the man turned back toward the leader. "It's over," he said, but the rancher only laughed. "You think this changes anything? You think she'll go with you now? Ask her what she's done for us to stay alive." The words struck him harder than the storm outside. He looked at her, but her eyes fell to the ground. There was something she wasn't saying. "Don't listen," she whispered. "He's lying," the rancher smirked. "You sure about that?" The man stepped closer, pressing the rifle barrel against his chest. "You'll tell me everything before this night ends," he said, his voice low. Before the rancher could reply, a deafening explosion shook the ground. Flames burst from the back of the mill. One of the oil barrels had caught fire. The roof began to collapse, sending sparks raining through the room. The woman screamed as beams fell and he pulled her toward the door. Outside, chaos ruled. Smoke and fire mixed with rain. Men shouting in both English and Apache, the thunder rolling overhead like cannon fire. The leader of the warriors rode through the chaos, rallying his men, his voice strong against the storm. The man led his wife through the smoke toward the creek, every step a battle against falling debris and gunfire. Behind them, the rancher's voice called out, mocking, desperate, vengeful. "You'll never leave this valley alive." He didn't look back. He could feel the heat rising, the air growing thick with smoke. The Apache surrounded the last of the soldiers, their victory almost complete. But he knew it wasn't over yet. When they reached the edge of the water, she stumbled, clutching his arm. "There's something I need to tell you," she said between gasps. "Something I never could before." He turned to her, rain running down his face, fire reflecting in his eyes. "Not now," he said. "We have to move!" But she shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand. If we go now, they'll follow. Because what they want isn't just me. It's what I hid before they took me." He stared at her, the roar of the battle fading behind them. "What did you hide?" Before she could answer, a gunshot rang out, sharp and final, cutting through the sound of the storm. He turned, but the darkness swallowed the source. All he saw was her face, pale and full of fear, as she whispered his name and looked past him toward the fire consuming the valley. The truth he had chased for months was finally within reach, but it was about to cost him everything. The gunshot echoed through the valley like thunder rolling over the plains. For a moment, time froze. The fire from the burning mill painted the rain red, the smoke curling through the storm like ghosts rising from the earth. The man spun around, his heart pounding, eyes searching the darkness for where the shot had come from. His wife stood in front of him, her hands trembling, her breath shallow. Then she fell. He caught her before she hit the ground, the world around him collapsing into noise and flame. "No," he whispered, pulling her close. "Stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open, her voice faint under the roar of the storm. "I tried to tell you," she said. "They were never after me. They wanted the deed, the papers, the proof of the valley's worth." He felt the blood warm against his hands, though she tried to smile through the pain. "I hid them," she breathed. "Under the old willow, by the creek, our place." He could barely hear her over the chaos, but he understood. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about protecting what they had both built. He looked toward the burning mill where the last of the gunfire was fading. The Apache had taken the upper hand. The soldiers and ranchers were retreating, their courage gone with the flames. He lifted her gently, carrying her toward the creek as the rain began to pour harder. Each step felt heavier, his boots sinking into the wet soil, but he didn't stop. He could still feel the faint beat of her heart against his chest, weak but alive. When they reached the willow, the same tree where they had once carved their initials, he laid her down beneath its sheltering branches. Lightning flashed, lighting up her face. She was pale, her lips trembling as she looked up at him. "Do you remember?" she whispered. "The day you built the swing here. You said no storm could ever touch us." He nodded, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I remember," he said. "And I'm here just like I promised." She reached up, her fingers brushing his cheek. "Then keep it safe," she said. "Our land, our home. Don't let them take it again." Before he could answer, her hand fell still. The rain came down harder, washing away the blood from his fingers, soaking through the earth that had once given them both life. He pressed his forehead against hers, his chest aching with a pain no bullet could match. The storm raged on, but he no longer heard it. When the Apache leader found him, the fire behind them had begun to die. Smoke drifted through the valley, and the cries of battle had turned to silence. The warrior said nothing at first. He simply stood under the rain, watching the man cradle his wife beneath the willow. Then quietly he said, "She is with the wind now. You cannot bring her back." The man didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the water flowing beside them, carrying away ash and fragments of wood. "She kept something hidden," he said after a while. "Papers, they wanted the valley." The leader nodded slowly. "Then they will come again," he said. "Men like them never stop wanting what others have." The man looked up, the pain in his eyes hardening into something else. "Then we'll be ready." At dawn, the rain stopped. Smoke curled upward from the burned-out ranches, rising into a sky streaked with gray and gold. The Apache gathered their wounded and their fallen, burying them with quiet songs that echoed across the hills. The man helped, saying little, his hands moving automatically. When it was done, the leader approached him once more. "This land," the warrior said, looking out over the valley, has seen too much death, but you have given it meaning again. The fire you carried lit more than revenge, the man nodded. You gave me more than I can ever repay, he said. The leader's eyes softened. Then live, he said simply. That is how you repay it. When the riders left that morning, their silhouettes stretched long against the sun, fading into the desert beyond. The man stayed behind, standing among the ashes of what had been. He found what his wife had hidden beneath the willow, a small tin box wrapped in oilcloth still dry inside. Inside were the papers proving their ownership of the valley, signed and sealed years ago. Alongside them was a note written in her hand. It said only one line. If you ever find this, it means I kept my promise. He folded the note carefully and placed it in his pocket. The papers didn't matter anymore. The land would remain his, not because of ink or signatures, but because he had fought for it, bled for it, and lost everything in its name. The town was silent when he rode through later that week. People watched from behind windows and doors, too afraid or too ashamed to speak. The sheriff stood near the saloon, hat in hand, looking like a man who had run out of excuses. The man stopped in front of him but didn't dismount. You saw what they did, he said. You let it happen, the sheriff's voice cracked. I was told not to interfere. Orders from above. The man looked at him, his face unreadable. Then maybe those orders will keep you warm when winter comes, he said. He rode on, leaving the town behind. The wind followed him, carrying the faint smell of smoke and rain. Weeks passed. The valley began to heal. The grass grew again where the fire had scorched the earth, and the river ran clear. The man rebuilt his cabin with his own hands, setting each beam in place with quiet patience. He didn't speak much, but sometimes, when the wind moved through the cottonwoods, he would stop working and listen. It sounded like her voice. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges, he stood by the creek where the willow bent toward the water. The swing still hung there, swaying slightly in the breeze. He reached out and touched it, feeling the rough rope under his fingers. I did what you asked, he said softly. It's safe now. He looked across the land, the wide valley, the distant hills, the endless sky. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was something close. He had lost the woman who gave his life meaning, but in her memory he had kept the land alive. That was the promise they had both made, to build something that would last longer than themselves. As night fell, the first stars appeared, bright and steady. He sat by the fire outside his new cabin, the locket resting in his hand. Inside it was the same small portrait, worn but whole. He smiled faintly, the lines on his face deepened by time and loss. You were right, he whispered. The storm didn't take us. It just changed us. In the distance, a wolf howled, long and mournful, and the sound echoed through the hills. The wind carried it away, mingling with the rustle of trees and the soft flow of water. The man leaned back, letting the warmth of the fire touch his face. The land that had once been soaked in blood now breathed again, quiet and strong. He closed his eyes, hearing the whisper of her voice in the rustling leaves, the same voice that had once filled his home with laughter. Somewhere in that sound he found peace, not the kind that forgets, but the kind that remembers and forgives. And as the fire crackled low, the valley settled into silence, holding its secrets beneath the stars. The man who had ridden back with 500 Apache warriors no longer sought revenge. He sought only the life they had dreamed of, and this time he meant to keep it no matter how many storms came again.